It was one of those stops you don't think twice about, just enough time to fill the tank, grab something salty, and stretch your legs before the next 100 miles of empty road. On the morning of June 18, 2011, Daniel Reeves pulled into a remote gas station just outside Elko County, Nevada. The station sat low against the scrubland, a faded blue roof, one aging fuel pump, and a convenience store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. It was the kind of place you only stopped if you had to. And Daniel did. He'd been camping solo in the Ruby Mountains for 3 days, his version of a reset. Just him, a tent, and a handwritten list in his wallet of things he wanted to sort out before turning 43. He was due back by dinner. His wife, Rachel, had chicken thawing in the sink. His teenage son, Eli, had a baseball game that evening, and his daughter, Morgan, had begged him to bring back one of those candy sticks from the mountain gift shop. Daniel's truck pulled into Pump 2 at exactly 10:42 a.m. The surveillance camera above the front door caught the entire sequence in crystal clear footage. Daniel stepping out in cargo shorts, faded green hoodie, and hiking boots still dusted in red soil. He smiled at the cashier through the glass as he entered. At 10:44 a.m., he paid cash for a soda, a pack of jerky, and a chocolate bar. He made a joke about the heat, something the clerk would later describe as normal, friendly, just a guy on the road. He exited the store at 10:46. The last confirmed image of him was captured at 10:47, leaning against the truck, head tilted back like he was watching the clouds. The engine was running. The driver's door was open. His phone was still on the seat. The clerk remembered looking out the window a minute later and noticing the truck still there. Alone. By 10:53, a different customer walked in and mentioned there was a truck out front with no driver, engine still going. The clerk stepped outside to check, called out once, then twice. No answer. Daniel Reeves was gone. Within an hour, local deputies arrived. No sign of struggle, no footprints leading into the desert, no tire tracks other than Daniel's, no calls made or received, no wallet left behind. The cash from his earlier purchase matched the amount missing from his account. The truck wasn't damaged. The driver's seat wasn't pushed back or forward. It was like he vanished between breaths. The gas station's second camera, mounted behind the building, hadn't worked in years. There were no witnesses, no known enemies. And for no logical reason, a man would abandon his vehicle in the middle of a desert with no water, no phone, and no warning. His wife Rachel didn't believe it from the start. She said Daniel wouldn't just walk off, not without saying something, not without calling. Their daughter Morgan checked his email account obsessively. She believed he might have left a clue, something no one had noticed. His son Eli barely spoke for days. He just sat in the truck's passenger seat parked in the driveway, phone clutched in his hands, replaying every voicemail his father had left in the last year. Police organized a search within the first 24 hours. Helicopters with infrared sensors swept a 12-mile radius. Search and rescue teams scoured the nearby ravines, caves, and brush. Volunteers showed up with ATVs and maps. Dogs picked up nothing. The temperature hit 97 degrees that afternoon. Daniel had no water with him. His camping gear was still in the bed of the truck, rolled up, clean, untouched. By day 3, the official narrative shifted. Maybe he wandered off. Maybe he got turned around. Maybe he suffered heat stroke and got disoriented. Maybe, just maybe, he meant to disappear. It wouldn't be the first time someone walked away from their life without leaving a note. But Rachel pushed back hard. She handed investigators her husband's camping journal. Each page is dated. Each entry is methodical. His plans for the weekend included exact trail names, return times, and gear checklists. She said Daniel was steady, not spontaneous. He kept records of gas mileage and carried 2 lighters even when one worked. That was the kind of man who left a trail. That was the kind of man who came home. When the story broke on local news, the footage was aired on every station. Daniel buying snacks, smiling, leaning on the truck, then gone. People called in dozens of tips. A man matching his description had been seen hitchhiking in Idaho. Another said he'd checked into a motel under a fake name in Utah. Every lead was followed. None panned out. A local rancher claimed he saw a black SUV parked at the far edge of the gas station lot earlier that day. Said it looked out of place, no plates on the front. It was the only vehicle that hadn't been accounted for. That tip was noted, never followed up. By the end of the first month, the posters started curling at the edges. The search teams thinned out. The story fell from the front page. But Daniel's truck remained impounded, untouched, quiet. The keys are still in the ignition. The last song playing on the radio was a 2004 country ballad about home and the people waiting there. What haunted people wasn't just that Daniel disappeared, it was how quiet the moment was. No scream, no struggle, no panic. Just a normal stop in a sun-bleached town, a man leaning against his truck, and then nothing. As if the desert had opened and swallowed him whole. But what no one knew then, what wouldn't be discovered for another 13 years, was that Daniel Reeves had left something behind. Something no one thought to look for, something buried deeper than they expected. And when it surfaced, it would shake everything. The first 48 hours were brutal. Temperatures spiked above 100, rattlesnakes curled under shade brush, dust blew in thick waves across the search grid. Helicopters circled the open scrubland with infrared cameras, banking slowly over every ridge, every dip in the earth. Search dogs were brought in from Reno, noses low, pacing the edges of Daniel's last known location. A grid was marked out in red flagging tape, half mile by half mile, around the gas station and fanned outward. Deputies on horseback moved methodically across the perimeter. Volunteers poured in. Hunters, hikers, off-duty firefighters. They came with canteens, binocs, and quiet resolve. Every one of them expected to find something. A dropped wallet, a shredded piece of clothing, boot tracks in the sand. They didn't. On the second night, a team located what they thought were partial footprints heading west, but by morning they'd disappeared, worn away by wind. A pair of sunglasses was found near a cluster of rocks, but they weren't Daniel's. By the end of the third day, not a single item had been recovered that definitively belonged to him. It was as if he'd stepped off the edge of the frame and kept walking into a place the desert refused to remember. Rachel Reeves arrived in Elko that same evening. She hadn't slept. Her voice was hoarse from phone calls, from crying, from trying to hold steady in front of the kids. Eli and Morgan were left behind with her sister in Sacramento. Rachel insisted on seeing the truck herself. A deputy walked her through it. The driver's door is still open. Engine off now, but originally left running. Phone on the seat, screen locked. She stared at it for a long time. Daniel never left his phone. He used it for GPS, even when he knew the route. It was how he texted her from the trail, sent little jokes, sent photos of rock formations that looked like faces. He would never have left it behind. The search was scaled back after the 5th day. Law enforcement cited exhaustion, heat risk, and resource limitations. They shifted focus to the possibility of voluntary disappearance. A deputy mentioned to Rachel, gently, awkwardly, that sometimes people vanish on purpose. Maybe Daniel had left clues, or debts, or someone else. Rachel shot that down immediately. She gave them bank records, emails, calendar entries, photos. She printed out his last grocery list from the fridge. Coffee, bagels, toothpaste, trail mix. Nothing about it said goodbye. Morgan spent the first week combing through her dad's laptop. She was 15 then, sharp, introverted. Her way of coping was by organizing everything, every folder, every file, every call. She opened texts he'd sent the week before the trip. He'd joked about fixing the screen door when he got back, said he was bringing her a surprise from the ranger station. On the night before he left, he told her to keep an eye on Eli at baseball practice. He still swings like he's trying to knock satellites out of orbit, he'd written. It didn't sound like a man about to disappear. Eli didn't talk much those first weeks. He was 13, quiet, angry. He replayed voicemails over and over. The last one was from 2 nights before the gas station stop. Daniel was by a river, laughing. Said he'd found a weird beetle and thought Eli would have liked it. That was it. Just that. There was no warning in his voice, no tremor of hesitation. Just a dad, mid-trip, reaching out. Detectives started doing what detectives do, checking Daniel's financials, scanning for any red flags. They looked into life insurance policies, credit reports, anything that might suggest a motive. There wasn't much. One account had an auto pay that had recently bounced, but it was a minor glitch, not a financial crisis. His work records showed no friction. His last few therapy notes, Daniel had seen a counselor for general stress after his mother died, showed no signs of instability. In fact, the notes described him as balanced, pragmatic, and deeply family-oriented. Still, the theories started. A local reporter hinted at the idea that maybe Daniel had grown tired of domestic life. Maybe the camping trip was a dry run. Maybe he'd found someone online. Maybe he just walked away. Rachel refused to entertain it. She issued a short, calm statement to the press. Daniel didn't run. He wouldn't do that to his children. Then she went quiet. What gnawed at investigators were the details that didn't add up. The prepaid gas card was used at the pump, but only partially. No follow-up transaction. The cash he used inside the store left no trail. The security footage captured him exiting the store at 10:46 a.m. and leaning against the truck, but nothing after that. No witnesses saw him leave. No movement caught outside the frame. The black SUV tip given by a second trucker days later was noted but never confirmed. No plate, no dashcam footage, just a fleeting observation from a man passing through. By the third week, the case went cold. Flyers came down, media attention thinned. The sheriff's office labeled it a disappearance under unknown circumstances. That phrase stuck like sand in a wound. Unknown circumstances. Rachel started sleeping with her phone on her chest. Morgan kept a notebook with every timeline she could piece together. Eli stopped showing up to baseball. No one could tell them where to look next. No trail, no crime scene, no proof of life. Nobody. Just a truck at Pump 2 and the heavy, awful silence that followed. The circle of grief never closed. Not for Rachel, not for Morgan, not for Eli, and not for the investigators who couldn't file it away as a typical case. Something was wrong. Something was missing. But whatever it was had vanished with Daniel into a landscape that had given up nothing but heat, silence, and space. And yet, deep down, something in Morgan refused to let go. Even then, she had a feeling. Not that he was alive, but that he'd left something behind, something no one else had seen. Not yet. It was on the 7th day after Daniel's disappearance when a deputy walking the perimeter found something strange behind the gas station, parallel tire tracks imprinted faintly in the hard-pan dirt. They veered off the main gravel path, curling behind a line of scrub brush and disappearing toward the flat open basin beyond. They didn't match Daniel's truck. The treads were wider, deeper, fresh, maybe 12 hours old, maybe 24. In the heat and wind, tracks faded fast, but this set was clean enough to photograph, and for a brief moment, the investigation had direction again. Search teams extended their sweep westward. A drone unit scanned the direction of the tracks, but no vehicle, no debris, no sign of habitation was found in the area. Just sun-baked sand, brittle shrubs, and the occasional shattered glass from long-abandoned beer bottles. The gas station clerk, when asked again, shook his head, said he didn't notice any car back there, didn't hear anything either, but someone must have driven it, and that someone hadn't come through the front entrance. Later that day, deputies picked up a transient man wandering near the interstate 5 miles south. He was sunburned, mumbling, and carried a backpack filled with scavenged goods. A photo of Daniel was shown to him. The man claimed he hadn't seen anyone, but then said something odd, that people go missing out there all the time, especially if they talk too much. He was held for questioning, but nothing he said could be verified. He had no connection to Daniel, no weapon, and no vehicle. After 48 hours, he was released. His name was never released to the public. A day later, the department's anonymous tip line received its first call from a self-identified psychic. She claimed Daniel was underground, that he had been taken by 2 men and was being kept alive in a metal structure near a place of rust and water. The call was recorded, transcribed, and dismissed. Officers had heard this kind of thing before, voices offering visions, gut feelings, mystical answers, They rarely helped, but they still logged the report. Over the next 2 weeks, dozens of tips came in. One said Daniel was spotted at a gas station in Idaho, 200 miles north. Another said he was seen barefoot walking down a highway shoulder in Utah. A retired schoolteacher from Arizona swore she saw him begging for change outside a strip mall. Each time, local authorities were contacted, security footage was reviewed, and none of it panned out. The sightings contradicted each other: wrong hair color, wrong height, wrong time zone. Grief makes people see things, and the media spreads faces until strangers think they're memories. Still, the Reeves family followed up on each one. Morgan started creating a digital map, plotting every call, every lead, every mile of distance between them. Her wall was covered in string and thumbtacks, articles printed out, emails pinned to corkboard. At 15, she was building a case file better organized than what the sheriff's department had. Her mother didn't stop her. It gave her something to do. Eli kept his distance. He said the sightings made it worse. Every dead lead felt like a new way to lose him all over again. The tire tracks faded from the case notes. No matching vehicle was ever found. No new prints turned up in that direction. But in the background of all this chaos, quiet, almost forgotten, was one detail that never made it into the final report. A part-time clerk at the gas station, 19 years old, worked the early shift. He'd been off duty the morning Daniel disappeared, but stopped by to grab something from the back office. When asked again, 2 weeks after the incident, he remembered seeing a black SUV parked at the far edge of the lot just after 10:30. It was unusual. People didn't hang around that part of the lot. No shade, no reason to park there. He'd glanced at it twice, said it was matte black, possibly missing a front plate. The windows were dark, too dark to see inside. He didn't think much of it until the next day, when everyone was talking about the disappearance. But by then, he hadn't told anyone. No one asked. When he did mention it to one of the responding deputies, the note was logged, then buried beneath a flood of other reports. The SUV wasn't seen again. No plates were found. No other employee mentioned it. Years later, when asked about the case, a former investigator admitted off record that they never pursued the SUV lead. Too vague, he said. No evidence it was involved, and at the time, resources were stretched thin. It wasn't negligence exactly, just the weight of limited bandwidth. One more tip among 100, one more unknown in a desert full of them. The family never heard about the SUV until years later, when Morgan obtained a partial copy of the case file through a Freedom of Information request. By then, it felt like just another door that had already been shut, a shadow parked in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe the right place, and maybe exactly on time. As the third week closed, the case lost momentum. The original search teams returned to their cities. The media moved on to other stories. The desert cooled slightly at night, but the silence stayed hot, unbearable. Rachel brought the kids back home to Sacramento, but they left a small flyer taped to the side of Pump 2. Just one image: Daniel's face, smiling. Below it, a single line: "If you saw anything at all, call us." The number never changed, and the phone never stopped ringing. But the answers didn't come. Only more voices, more sightings, more noise, all pointing in different directions. All of them are ghosts. By the summer of 2012, the wind had worn Daniel's name from most of the flyers. The sheriff's office had moved on to newer cases, and the few remaining reporters who'd followed the disappearance had stopped calling. 13 months had passed since that day at the gas station. Rachel Reeves held a quiet memorial in their backyard, not because she had accepted anything, but because the silence had begun to harden around the edges of her children. There was nobody there, no closure, just a date on a calendar that refused to stop circling back. Morgan stood at the edge of the gathering that day, silent, unmoving. She was 16 now, leaner, sharper, and far quieter than before. She didn't cry during the memorial. She hadn't cried in months. Instead, she watched. She watched how people touched her mother's arm with empty reassurances, how they nodded at Eli like he'd grown into the man of the house, how they kept saying, "You never really know what someone's going through." But Morgan believed she did. She believed her father hadn't left. She believed something had gone very wrong, and she was starting to believe that whatever it was, the people in charge hadn't looked deep enough. It started with a USB drive. Tucked in the bottom drawer of Daniel's desk at home, long since cleared out, boxed, and stored in the garage, it had gone unnoticed until Morgan was sorting through the last of his files for a school project. It was labeled only with the year, 2011. Inside were spreadsheets, old photos, a few scanned receipts, and one folder that stopped her cold. To sort, private. In it, a series of screenshots from his online banking history. Most were mundane. Recurring payments, utility bills, campsite reservations. But one jumped out. A $7,000 cash withdrawal dated just 6 days before his trip. It hadn't shown up in the statements police had reviewed. She remembered because they had shown her. They said there was no large cash activity. Morgan didn't tell her mother right away. She wanted more before bringing it up. So she kept digging. She filed a records request through a public access portal, pretending it was for a school report. It took weeks, but eventually she got partial case documents, most of it redacted, but enough to see what the original investigation had missed or ignored. One detail struck her like a gut punch. The gas station had 2 cameras. One faced the front entrance, and one, the old model behind the building, hadn't been functioning, according to reports. But Morgan found a service log from the store's security provider, dated 2 weeks before Daniel's disappearance, showing both systems were fully operational and had passed diagnostic checks. That second angle, if it existed, would have shown the rear lot, the edge of the scrubland, and, most critically, any vehicle that may have approached from behind. But there was no footage from that camera on record. It had either been erased or never collected. Morgan began to write everything down. She didn't tell anyone, not even Eli, who had grown quiet in a different way, resentful of the void, angry at hope. He didn't want to keep reopening what the world had tried to bury, but Morgan couldn't close it, not with questions like these. Then came the note. It wasn't hidden, just overlooked, folded inside the back of one of Daniel's field journals, a pocket-sized spiral he used to jot down trail info, wildlife sightings, the kinds of lists only he could decode. Scrawled across the back page in his handwriting was a line underlined twice. "I think I need to tell someone." Might be bigger than I thought, no context, no name, no date. But the ink matched entries from a few weeks before the trip. Morgan scanned it 3 times to be sure she wasn't imagining it. Then she showed it to Rachel. Her mother went quiet. The kind of quiet that closes a door without making a sound. She stared at it for a long time, ran her finger along the underlined sentence, and said, almost in a whisper, "They told me there was nothing." They had asked back then. Police, journalists, family friends. Had Daniel been acting strange? Had he said anything unusual? Was he under any stress? Rachel had answered no. At the time, it was true. But now this note, paired with the cash withdrawal and the missing footage, made it impossible to ignore the idea that Daniel had been carrying something more than a backpack on that trip. Morgan tried contacting the original lead detective, but his number was disconnected. She wrote a letter to the department. No response. It felt like the case had been packed away in the same box as the old flyers, faded, inconvenient, and no longer worth attention. So she built her own file, every screenshot, every timeline, every question no one had answered. She started mapping Daniel's final week in reverse, his route from the bank to the gear store, to the library where he'd printed something she still hadn't found. Every timestamp, every receipt. She wanted to know who he talked to, what he was trying to tell, and whether someone had made sure that message never got out. Because to Morgan, it was no longer a question of whether her father disappeared. It was why. And as the second year without him approached, she began to understand something else, something quieter and darker. Maybe her father hadn't simply vanished. Maybe he'd been erased. It was Morgan's file that caught his attention, a cardboard box packed tight with color-coded tabs, laminated photos, redacted printouts, and a timeline so detailed it read like a forensic diary. Her mother had mentioned him once, quietly, like she didn't fully trust herself for saying it out loud. His name was Ray Mercer. Retired homicide. 40 years on the job. Grew up 2 counties over. No nonsense, no promises. But he'd worked desert cases before. Knew the terrain, the culture, the gaps between federal and local jurisdictions. When he met Morgan and Rachel in a small diner off Route 80, he asked one question before he agreed to help. "Are you prepared for an answer you won't like?" Morgan said yes. Rachel didn't speak at all. Mercer started at the beginning. Not the gas station footage that had been reviewed by 10 sets of eyes already, but the week before. The cash withdrawal. The scribbled journal entry. The second surveillance angle that was never logged. He flagged every inconsistency, every silence disguised as certainty. Then he asked for Daniel's full trip itinerary. Rachel brought out the old email printouts and camping permits. Daniel had planned to camp near Harrison Pass for 2 nights. A less popular trail, rougher, more isolated, the kind of place you didn't stumble onto by accident. Mercer circled the map, nodding slowly. Then he said something that changed the air around the table. "Have you ever heard of corridor drops?" Rachel frowned. Morgan leaned forward. Mercer explained. It wasn't common knowledge, but in the early 2000s, there were scattered reports of organized routes through remote public lands, used not just for smuggling people, but for staging illicit handoffs of contraband, money, even bodies. Places far enough off the grid that no cell towers pinged, no cameras watched, and no patrols checked for days. Nevada had a few. Harrison Pass, according to a 2006 federal memo Mercer still had, was one of them. It sounded wild, like a conspiracy too vague to grab. But then Mercer pulled out a thin manila envelope. Inside were printouts of 3 missing persons cases from 2007, 2009, and 2010. All men, all traveling alone through central Nevada, all vanished near remote service roads. No vehicles found, no messages. Just gone. Mercer didn't say they were connected to Daniel, but he didn't have to. A few weeks later, Mercer got a call back from someone he knew in DOT enforcement. Just a hunch, he'd said. "Could you check way station logs from the week of June 18th, 2011? Eastbound lanes mostly. Nothing formal. Just looking for anomalies." 3 days passed, then came a name. Martin Locke. Long-haul trucker, 17 years on the road. Filed an informal report at a way station in Wendover 2 days after Daniel vanished. Said a barefoot man approached his rig around 11 p.m., disoriented, wearing what looked like hiking clothes. I tried to use the station's landline. Didn't say much, just kept asking if they were gone yet. Then walked off before anyone could stop him. No one had connected it to Daniel at the time. The clerk didn't think it matched any missing persons, but Locke remembered. He said the man looked shaken, scared. Didn't smell like drugs or alcohol, just panic. Mercer asked for the incident report. The details were thin. The physical description was a loose match. No security footage was saved. Cameras had looped over themselves within 24 hours. No fingerprints, no phone call recorded, nothing to confirm or deny it. But for the first time in over a year, there was movement. A ripple. When Mercer told Rachel, she covered her mouth with both hands and just nodded. Morgan stayed stone still, then asked, "Why barefoot?" Mercer didn't answer. Instead, he called in a favor with a contact in Homeland Security. Asked quietly if there had been any unusual chatter in the area that week. Nothing official came back, but the contact hinted at something that made Mercer pause. There had been an unmarked federal vehicle stationed 2 miles from Harrison Pass that same weekend. No details on why, no paper trail. That detail never made it into any police report. It wasn't the kind of thing local departments were told. Jurisdiction blurred out there. Land crisscrossed by federal, state, and tribal boundaries. Things got lost. Things got overlooked, sometimes on purpose. Mercer cautioned the family not to jump to conclusions. One sighting was not proof, one witness was not closed. But Morgan didn't care about closure anymore. She wanted facts, and that man at the way station, whoever he was the first tangible piece of evidence since the day her father disappeared. They tracked down Martin Locke. He lives in Boise now, retired. I still remember that night. Described the man again. Brown hair, mid-40s, sunburned. Looked like he hadn't slept in days. Keep checking the dark, like someone might follow. Locke asked if he needed help. The man said, "I already had help." "I just need a phone." Morgan showed him a picture of her father. Locke blinked. I looked at it, then shook his head, said he couldn't be sure. It had been too long. But something about the eyes, the fear, felt familiar. Like a man who'd run a long way, only to find there was nowhere left to go. That night, Morgan sat alone in her room, the box of case files open beside her. She flipped back to her father's journal, to the underlined words. "Might be bigger than I thought." For the first time, she believed him. By the time the 5th year passed, Daniel Reeves's case had been reassigned 4 times. Each new investigator started with interest, skimmed the file, made a few calls, and then quietly moved on. It wasn't malice, it was volume. Missing persons files piled up fast in small departments, especially cold ones. Leads expired. Paperwork was boxed and stored in off-site archives. Some digital files were corrupted or mislabeled during a system migration in 2014. Emails bounced, contacts retired, and in the long, slow churn of bureaucratic neglect, Daniel's name became just another unclosed tab in a system built to forget. But Morgan didn't. She was 21 now, finishing college with a criminal justice major and a part-time job in records administration. She still wore her father's trail watch every day, though the band was cracked and the face scratched. Her wall back home still held the original map, still littered with pins and scribbled timelines. But the digital file, her master case archive, had grown to over 3,000 documents, tagged, cross-referenced, logged. She knew the case better than any living detective. Better, she suspected, than her father had known what he was stepping into. It was late in the fall semester when she found the gap. She'd been reviewing the call records from the area again, something she'd done dozens of times, but this time she was checking the formatting of the logs themselves, not just the entries. She noticed something strange. The time window around 10:30 a.m. on June 18, 2011, was shorter than expected. Missing entries. When she checked with the phone provider's archival index, it showed the full log had been backed up to an off-site database due to a temporary server outage that week. Somehow, that version had never made it back into the investigative record. She filed a formal request under Nevada's open records laws. It took nearly 3 months to be approved. The full call log arrived in a compressed file, thousands of lines, mostly noise, missed calls, disconnected numbers, business faxes. But 40 minutes after Daniel was last seen on gas station security footage, one record jumped out. A 911 call, 15 seconds long, placed from a prepaid cell tower near the station. No number associated. The originating line had been disconnected hours after the call. It had never been reviewed, never transcribed, never flagged. It wasn't in the original sheriff's file. It had slipped through a bureaucratic crack and sat untouched for 6 years. Morgan requested the audio. The agency pushed back. Too old, too low priority. She pushed harder, quoted statute, send letters, called. Eventually, someone sent it. A short .wav file, tinny and damaged, like it had been recorded through glass. She played it in her apartment, alone on a loop for almost an hour. The call began with static, then faint breathing. An engine in the background, revving, then stalling. Then a voice. Male, distant, one word clearly audible. Help. The rest was noise. No location, no ID, no follow-up. She sent the clip to Mercer. He was slower now, battling early-stage Parkinson's, but his mind was still sharp. He had someone run the audio through cleanup software. The results were inconclusive, but the engine pattern, specifically the idle and choke sequence, matched the engine model in Daniel's 2006 pickup. The same one was found running at pump 2. It didn't confirm anything, but it narrowed the possibilities. Morgan took the evidence to the Elko County Sheriff's Office. The current lead investigator, a man who'd inherited the case only recently, listened politely. He agreed to reopen a review, promised to pass it up. But Morgan knew the pattern. This would be filed, labeled, coded, and then, likely, buried again. She wasn't content with that. She wrote a letter to local media, then regional, then national. She didn't embellish, she didn't accuse me. She laid out the timeline, the mishandled evidence, the call no one had listened to. She didn't ask for coverage. She asked for help. 3 months later, a freelance journalist from Reno reached out. She was working on a piece about unsolved rural disappearances and wanted to talk. Morgan gave her everything: the audio, the timeline, the questions that had never been answered. The article didn't go viral, but it was read, especially by people who remembered the story. And one of those people was a technician who had worked part-time at the way station near Wendover in 2011. He emailed Morgan directly, said he remembered the barefoot man, said the clerk had made a call that night to someone at the local sheriff's office, said it had never been logged properly. He didn't know what happened next, but he remembered the tone of the man's voice, said it sounded like someone who'd finally reached a place he thought was safe, only to realize he was still being hunted. Morgan stared at the email for a long time. Something had always bothered her about the timeline, the tightness of it, how someone could vanish so quickly. But now she saw something else. Daniel hadn't vanished in an instant. He had time to try, time to run, time to call for help. And somehow, that message, his only message, had sat unheard in a storage drive for 6 years, buried, like everything else. The attic was hotter than she remembered. Dust clung to the beams like old secrets, and the light that filtered through the single window was dull, like it knew better than to shine too brightly on anything left up here. Morgan hadn't planned to spend the afternoon going through her mother's storage. Rachel was finally moving to a smaller place, and Morgan had come out of obligation more than sentiment. But now, standing among the taped boxes of school art projects, winter coats no one wore anymore, and stacks of forgotten furniture, she found herself frozen by one thing in particular: a rusted metal box wedged behind an old cedar trunk. It wasn't labeled. The lock on the front was simple but intact. Morgan brought it down anyway. She didn't ask her mother about it, not yet. She waited until that night, long after the moving truck had pulled away and Rachel had gone to bed. In her own apartment, she sat at the kitchen table with the box in front of her, a small crowbar beside it. It took 3 careful minutes to pop the latch. The sound it made, dry, sharp, startled her more than she'd expected. Inside was a stack of worn paper maps, folded into fourths, their edges brittle. Underneath them, a prepaid burner phone, battery removed, no SIM. And at the bottom, a USB drive taped to a folded note that simply read, "Keep if something happens." Her stomach dropped. The handwriting was her father's. She didn't hesitate. She plugged the drive into her laptop and opened the single folder inside. 3 audio files, all unnamed, dated by the system metadata. The most recent was time-stamped 4 days before Daniel had disappeared. She clicked play. The recording started with breathing, soft, uneven, then the sound of shoes on gravel. His voice came in, low, strained, as if he was whispering into the receiver from behind something. "I don't know if this is being listened to. I'm recording in case it's not safe to write anything down. If Rachel or the kids ever hear this, I'm sorry. I should have come clean sooner." Morgan's pulse spiked. The next part was garbled. Wind interference, muffled phrases, then more breathing, then a clearer line. "I think they know I saw something. I don't think it was supposed to be where I was. There was a truck, no plates, men unloading something into the ravine. Could have been equipment, could have been something else. I didn't stay, I didn't look again. But they saw me silence. Then, I thought it was old stuff, something buried from years ago. But I was wrong. It's still happening. And I think they know who I am now." Another pause. The crunch of gravel again. Then what sounded like a vehicle passing in the distance. They've been near the house. Not every night, but I've seen the same car twice parked outside the trailhead. I think they're watching to see if I talk. Then something quieter, almost a whisper to himself. I made mistakes before. Thought they were in the past. But maybe that's what this is about. Maybe someone didn't forget the recording cut off abruptly. No goodbye, no explanation. Morgan stared at the playback bar, frozen at 3 minutes and 18 seconds. Her hands were cold. She played it again. There was no mention of names, no locations, but the weight in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a man playing out paranoia. This wasn't some imagined fear spiraling in solitude. It was focused, specific. Someone had scared him. Someone had been watching. She checked the other two recordings. The first was static-heavy, mostly ambient sounds, walking, car doors, some scribbled notes she couldn't make out. The second was a voice memo about a hiking route, standard, casual, nothing alarming. But that last recording, the one made 4 days before he disappeared, changed everything. Morgan opened the burner phone next. It had no SIM, but when she charged the battery and powered it on, she found 3 outgoing texts in the message history, each one sent to a different number, none of which were saved in contacts. You were right. It's still going on. Saw them again near mile marker 22. Too close now. If I disappear, tell them to check the pass. That last line hit her like a body blow. She had seen that phrase before. Check the pass. It was scrawled in the margin of one of Daniel's old trail maps, a small note she had once dismissed as just part of his gear planning. Now it reads differently. Now it reads like a warning. She printed the messages, archived the audio, backed up the drive in 3 separate encrypted folders. Then she called Mercer. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked only one question. Do you still have the maps? She did. He told her to bring everything. The next morning. That night, Morgan didn't sleep. She sat with the metal box in her lap, fingers tracing the edge. She thought about how close this had been to being lost forever, how it had sat above their heads for over a decade, quiet, waiting. All those years of unanswered questions, dead-end leads, whispers about voluntary disappearance. Her father hadn't vanished. He had warned them, and someone had made sure no one listened. It was late October 2023 when the call came. The kind of call Morgan had imagined, feared, and prepared for 1,000 different ways. But never like this. A road crew working east of Elko had been clearing ground for a shoulder expansion when one of the graders hit something solid. At first, they thought it was an animal burial, a coyote or stray dog maybe. The desert was full of old bones, but once the foreman spotted the torn nylon straps and canvas seams, everything stopped. It wasn't an animal. It was a duffel bag, and it had been buried deliberately. Deputies cordoned off the site within the hour. The remains inside were skeletal, wrapped in the remnants of a sleeping bag and weighted down with broken rebar and rocks. There were strips of duct tape stuck to the inner lining. A faded flannel shirt shredded by time clung to what was left of the rib cage. Inside a plastic zip pouch, tucked into a side pocket, were 2 laminated IDs. One was Daniel Reeves. The other belonged to a man who, on paper, had died in a boating accident in Oregon 6 years earlier. It took 4 days for the DNA to come back. It was him. Morgan didn't cry when she got the call. She didn't scream or drop the phone or ask anyone to repeat themselves. She just wrote it down. Time of discovery, coordinates, evidence list. She read the summary 3 times before reading it to her mother. Rachel sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, staring at the same cup of coffee until it went cold. Then she whispered something no one quite heard. And finally, I knew he wouldn't have left us. Forensic teams estimated the bag had been buried for more than a decade. 8 miles from the original gas station, off an old access road, now mostly unused. The location had never been part of the original search radius. The area wasn't mapped until years later. But what stood out most wasn't the distance. It was what the body showed. There were signs Daniel had lived for at least several days after the last known sighting. Bone bruising on the wrists indicated he'd been restrained, fractures along the ribs consistent with blunt force trauma, and based on hair samples found in the bag, forensic analysts believed he may not have been alone when he died. Some of the samples didn't match Daniel. The second identity card, belonging to the Oregon man, added another layer of confusion. The camping gear inside the bag matched items known to be in Daniel's possession, but some of it, specifically a water purifier and a satellite phone charger, wasn't his. They were newer models, items he hadn't purchased, items someone else had likely carried. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as homicide. No further detail, no timeline, no suspects. But now, they had a body. Morgan and Eli sat together at the coroner's office when they viewed the recovered belongings. Eli hadn't said much in recent years. Grief had taken a different path through him, hardened in places it hadn't for Morgan. But when he saw the flannel, saw the dented aluminum thermos, he reached out without thinking and gripped Morgan's arm. It was the first time in over a decade they both believed the same thing at the same moment. He had tried to come home. The site where the bag was found had no camera coverage, no signs of recent activity, no traceable DNA beyond Daniel's and the unidentified strands. But something about the location nagged at Mercer. He pulled out the old topographic maps, ones Daniel himself had marked up. He laid them over a recent satellite overlay. The burial site sat just 2 ridgelines away from the trail Daniel had supposedly taken during his last known hike. But what connected everything wasn't the proximity. It was the elevation. From that spot, you could see the back of the gas station through a long, narrow dip in the land. The same place where, according to that long-forgotten witness, a black SUV had once been parked. The connection wasn't hard evidence, but it was geography. It was positioning. It was the first physical link between where Daniel vanished and where he ended up. The duffel bag, once photographed and logged, was returned to the family. Morgan didn't open it. She didn't need to. She'd been carrying its weight for 12 years. The local paper ran a small headline: "Remains confirmed in 2011 disappearance." The article was brief, no suspects, no comment from law enforcement, no follow-up. But the internet did what the paper didn't. A local true crime forum picked it up, then a podcast, then a national feed. People started asking why it had taken so long, why no one had noticed a 911 call, why a surveillance angle had gone missing, why had a second ID been in the bag, why no one had cross-checked the Oregon death with Daniel's case. There were no answers yet, just one undeniable fact. The desert had given something back, not peace, not justice, but the truth, or at least the beginning of it. For 13 years, the question had hung in the air like heat off asphalt. What happened to Daniel Reeves after he stepped away from Pump 2? With the discovery of his remains, that question finally shifted from what to who. A second investigation was opened, not because of renewed interest, but because public pressure had left no room to avoid it. The headlines didn't fade this time. National outlets had latched on. Reddit threads went viral. Podcasters dug through the archived case file, questioning the silence, the gaps, the clues that had sat ignored. Morgan knew better than to trust momentum. She'd watched it evaporate before, but this time, something cracked open where the system had once held tight. It started with a knock. A detective from the new task force arrived at Morgan's door holding an old witness statement, the one about the black SUV parked near the gas station in 2011. It had been recorded, barely acknowledged, then shelved. Now it was back in play. The task force had traced the original source of the tip, a man named Walter Griggs, who had worked at the station part-time before leaving the area in 2013. They found him in a care facility in Reno, late-stage liver cancer. Not much time left. When asked about Daniel Reeves, he didn't hesitate. He said he'd lied, that back in 2011 he'd seen it all through the grimy back window of the station office. Daniel, standing near his truck, approached by 2 men, one tall, one heavyset. A brief argument, then they forced him toward a dark SUV. He didn't fight hard, just looked stunned, like he didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. The taller man had a badge clipped to his belt. Not the police, not local, something else. Griggs said he told the lead deputy at the time. But then, a day later, he was visited at home by a man in a suit. He was offered $5,000 to stay quiet and let the professionals do their job. He took it. He said he wasn't proud, said he didn't think it would matter. I thought maybe it was one of those cases where the guy just needed to go away for a while. I didn't think they were going to kill him. Griggs died 2 weeks after making the statement, but not before giving a name. Victor Bell, a former contractor with deep ties to infrastructure projects in the Elko region. Not a public figure, but well known in local development circles. He had acted as a fixer, someone who smoothed problems between landowners and regulatory agencies. He wasn't on any official rosters, but his name came up in several old permitting disputes, including one involving federal land south of Harrison Pass. Morgan's hands shook when she heard it. Daniel had mentioned Bell once, in a sticky note left in his trail log, now faded and barely legible. Bell says it's handled. Don't trust him. The task force followed the thread, quietly, carefully. They located former Forest Service emails from 2011. Daniel Reeves had submitted a complaint about illegal dumping near his campsite, rusted barrels, some leaking near a dry ravine. He'd reported it in writing. The logs confirmed receipt. But 6 days later, a second internal memo closed the file. Reason: complaint unsubstantiated. The memo was signed by a now retired federal investigator with ties to Bell's consulting firm. The audio file Daniel had recorded, his whispered warning about being watched, was dated 2 days after he made that report. Morgan read the timeline back to back. Her father had seen something, reported it, followed up, got scared. Then it disappeared. And someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to make sure he didn't speak again. When confronted with the findings, the local sheriff's office issued a brief statement acknowledging new developments under review. No arrests were made, not yet. But the FBI opened an inquiry into Bell's land dealings. Subpoenas were filed, old files reopened, names redacted, and then, finally, unredacted. Eli didn't say much. When Morgan told him, he just nodded once. So he was right, he said. All that time, he was right. They didn't celebrate. There was nothing in it to celebrate. But there was something else now. Not peace, but confirmation. Daniel hadn't wandered into danger. He'd walked straight into a system designed to protect itself. A man with a conscience, a complaint, a name, and a voice they tried to erase. The road near the gas station was paved not long after Daniel's remains were found. The desert, again, tried to cover its tracks. But the truth, once buried, was finally being exhumed. And Morgan, who had carried the silence for 13 years, was finally ready to speak where her father could not. The arrest came quietly, as if no one wanted to admit how long it had taken. On a gray morning in March 2024, Victor Bell was taken into custody without cameras, without headlines, without warning. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He'd lived under the assumption for 13 years that what he helped bury would stay buried. But the desert hadn't cooperated, and neither had Morgan. The charges weren't as clean as the family hoped: conspiracy to obstruct justice, interference with a federal investigation, involuntary manslaughter. Not murder. Not exactly. One of Bell's former subcontractors, under pressure from a federal immunity deal, had confessed. The story he told was methodical and cold. Daniel Reeves had seen something he wasn't supposed to see: unauthorized chemical dumping on protected land near a decommissioned mining site. The barrels weren't just trash, they were hazardous waste, and the site had been used as a quiet disposal route for years. Bell's operation had cut costs by bypassing permits, silencing complaints, and greasing the right officials to look the other way. Daniel wasn't one of them. The subcontractor said Bell approached him with a job: Intercept Daniel during his return trip, convince him to stay quiet, make it clear that pushing further wouldn't end well. He was supposed to scare him, but something went wrong. There was a struggle in the vehicle. Daniel hit his head. He was bleeding, disoriented. They panicked, drove him to a remote site, restrained him, and left him, alive but injured, expecting to return and sort it out later. They didn't return. He died in the bag. That's what the man said, at least. No one could prove if that was the full truth or just a version that made the outcome less damning. The trial was closed to the public. Sensitive federal documents were involved, including internal records showing that Daniel's complaint had indeed been received and suppressed. Not lost, not dismissed, suppressed. A single line in a reopened memo confirmed it. Do not escalate. Belle, handling Morgan and Eli, sat side by side on the back bench of the courtroom. Their mother didn't come. She said goodbye to Daniel in her own way years ago and said she couldn't do it again. But the kids stayed. They watched Belle avoid their eyes. Watch lawyers use words like logistics and incident and unintended consequence. Watch the system bend in real time, still protecting itself even as it admitted what it had done. The plea deal was accepted. Belle would serve time. Not enough, not close, but it was more than anyone expected to happen after all these years. The headline that finally appeared on national news was short, almost clinical. Contractor convicted in 2011 disappearance case. But it wasn't the end. 2 weeks after sentencing, the state's Environmental Commission held a press conference. They announced that the contaminated area Daniel had tried to report had been fully reclaimed. Tests confirmed no active seepage, no lingering toxicity. The dumping had stopped. The site was now designated for long-term rehabilitation and conversion into protected land. They had renamed the ridgeline Reeves Ridge. Morgan stood off to the side during the announcement. She didn't want the microphone. She didn't want to be thanked. All she wanted was for someone to say it out loud, that her father was right, that he wasn't paranoid, that he didn't run, that he had tried to protect something and someone tried to silence him for it. The press officer said it plainly. Daniel Reeves submitted an official complaint regarding the misuse of federal land. That complaint was confirmed. Delays in response contributed to the failure to prevent further harm. For that, we apologize to the Reeves family. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Eli walked the new trailhead a month later, a simple dirt path just overgrown enough to feel untouched. At the top, a wooden marker stood under an open sky. No flowers, no plaque, just a carving etched deep into the wood. For the one who didn't stay silent. Morgan found herself returning to the box sometimes, the one from the attic. She didn't listen to the recordings anymore. She knew them by heart, but she kept the maps, the notes, the burner phone with its 3 messages. She'd read the last one again, just recently. If I disappear, tell them to check the pass. He hadn't just left clues. He'd left warnings, directions, a final act of trust in the people he hoped would keep asking. For 13 years, he was a missing person, a name buried in digital records, a photo on a flyer. But now, Daniel Reeves had a place, a truth, a trail with his name on it. He was never supposed to be found, but he was. Because sometimes the silence doesn't win. Sometimes the man they buried doesn't stay buried.